The Duke of Meath came home from the war to find his bride gone, and her sister standing in the doorway of Greymoor Hall with her hands clasped, her expression carefully composed, and a child balanced on her hip who had, unmistakably, his own grey eyes. He stood in the November rain for a long moment. The carriage behind him dripped, the moors stretched in every direction, brown and immense, the heather flattened by 3 days of wind. His coat was still travel-damp from the journey north, his jaw still shadowed from Calais, his left hand still bearing the pale seam of a sabre cut received at Waterloo 3 years and 4 months before. He had written from Brussels. He had written from Paris. He had written from the coast. He had received in return 11 letters from his solicitor, 2 from his steward, and none at all from his wife. He said, "Where is Cecily?" And the woman in the doorway, Margaret Ashcroft, 26, the elder of the 2 sisters, the plain one, the overlooked one, the one no one had ever crossed a ballroom to speak to, said, in a voice that did not waver, "She left. 14 months ago, she is in Bath, I'm given to understand, though I have not had a letter in some time. She shifted the child higher on her hip. This is James. He will be 3 in February." The Duke of Meath, whose full name was Alastair Vane, who was 34 years old, who had commanded cavalry through 6 engagements and seen what men were capable of at their worst and at their finest, and who had believed, arriving at the end of this damp road, that there was nothing left in England capable of surprising him, looked at the child. Then he looked at Margaret. Then, slowly, he came inside. What no one in that house yet understood was that Margaret Ashcroft had been protecting 3 people simultaneously for 3 years, and that the cost of that protection had been everything she had. The story, as Margaret had maintained it to the village, to the tenants, to the solicitor who visited twice a year and asked very careful questions, was orderly and almost ordinary. The Duke had gone to war. His young wife, unused to the isolation of the Yorkshire moors, had suffered a difficult lying-in. Arrangements had been made. The child was with family. The Duke would return, and all would be set to rights in due course. It was, as stories went, thin enough to be believed by people who wished to believe it, and that was most people. The alternative required too much imagination about what the Honourable Cecily Ashcroft, beautiful golden-haired, the toast of 2 London seasons, might have actually done. What Cecily had actually done was this. She had married the Duke of Meath in April of 1815, 6 weeks before he returned to the continent for the Waterloo campaign. She had spent a season at Greymoor Hall in his absence, bored and cold and furious at her own mother for engineering a match to a man who was more title than warmth, and who had kissed her once on the cheek at their wedding and then departed for Belgium by morning. She had taken a great deal of consolation from the company of her neighbour, a Mr. Philip Crane of Hartfield, charming, warm, attentive, and catastrophically unsuitable. She had found herself with child by Christmas. She had, with admirable practicality, brought her elder sister north. It was Margaret she had written to. It was Margaret who had come without asking too many questions, who had managed the lying-in with the calm competence of a woman who had run her father's household since she was 16, who had sat with Cecily through the long February nights and then held James Vane on the first morning of his life while his mother slept. It was Margaret who had negotiated very quietly with the solicitor. It was Margaret who had told James, once he was old enough to ask, that his father was a great man who had been away serving England and would come home when he could. It was Margaret who had, when Cecily left for Bath with Mr. Crane 14 months ago, simply continued. She had nowhere else to go. That was the plain truth of it, though she had not dwelt on it much. Her father had died 2 years prior. The family estate in Lincolnshire had passed to a cousin, who had made it clear the sisters were welcome as guests for a season, and not beyond. Cecily had Bath and Mr. Crane. Margaret had Greymore Hall, a 3-year-old child who called her Mama because she had heard no one else to call by that name, and a set of household accounts that balanced because Margaret made them balance. She had, she supposed, made herself indispensable. She had not intended to. It was simply that there were things that needed doing, and she was the person present who knew how to do them. She had not anticipated Alistair Vane. He came inside, and she showed him the house, and he asked her, in the sitting room before a fire she had laid herself that morning because the housekeeper had taken ill, a series of questions in a voice that gave nothing away. How long had his wife been gone? Whether there had been any correspondence with him, whether the child was healthy, whether the estate accounts were in order. Each question was asked with the same flat precision, and Margaret answered each one without embellishment, because she had learned very early in her life that embellishment was the province of those who could afford to be disbelieved. Then he looked at her for a moment, the firelight catching the grey of his eyes, and said, "You stayed." "It was not a question," Margaret said. "Someone had to." He said nothing further that evening. He ate in his study. She ate in the kitchen with James, who had decided, after approximately 10 minutes of observing the tall man in the hall, that he was interesting, and wished to investigate further, and had been redirected with the help of a bowl of stewed apple and a carved wooden horse. She put James to bed at 8. She sat for a while at the writing table in the old schoolroom, which she had made her own because it was warm and because no one else wanted it. And she wrote in the household ledger, and she listened to the rain come down against the moorland. She was not afraid of him. She was not afraid of anything particularly, which was perhaps unusual in her situation. She was, if she was honest with herself, tired. Had anyone been watching closely, they might have seen the way she carried tiredness. Not as a weight, but as a kind of ballast. It kept her upright. It kept her precise. It was the tiredness of a woman who had been the most competent person in every room she'd entered for 3 years and had never once been thanked for it, and who had decided somewhere around the second winter that gratitude was not the thing she was doing this for. She was doing it for James, and she would continue doing it until someone made her stop. She expected the Duke to make her stop rather quickly. She expected a solicitor's letter, or a carriage, or a conversation that began with the words, "I am grateful for your service," and ended with the words, "But of course you'll understand you cannot remain." She prepared for it with the same methodical care with which she prepared for everything. She packed the 2 trunks she kept in the schoolroom. She wrote a letter to a former governess in Edinburgh who had once said in passing that there might be a situation there for a woman of Margaret's capabilities. She set the letter aside, unaddressed, and waited. No solicitor came. No carriage, no conversation. What came instead, 3 mornings after the Duke's return, was Alistair Vane himself, appearing in the doorway of the kitchen at 7:30 to find Margaret standing at the range, with her hair still pinned loosely from sleep, turning rashers in a pan, and the kitchen smelling of wood smoke and rendered fat and the particular damp wool warmth that had come to mean to Margaret something close to safety. She did not startle. She turned and looked at him and said, "There is porridge if you want it. The rashers will be done in 5 minutes." He said, "You cook." "I do a great many things," she said, and turned back to the range. James regarded him with round grey eyes that were, Margaret had long since ceased finding it remarkable, almost identical to the Duke's own. After a moment, James offered him a piece of bread. Some negotiation occurred that Margaret observed only from the corner of her eye, and by the time she set a plate before Alistair Vane, James had moved to sit beside him, and was explaining at some length and with moderate coherence something about a dog he had seen yesterday near the stables. The Duke listened. He ate. He answered James's questions with the same flat precision with which he had answered Margaret's, and James found this entirely satisfactory. When James was retrieved by the nursemaid, and the kitchen had gone quiet, the Duke sat for a moment with his cup and looked at her. He said, "Tell me what happened. All of it from the beginning." She told him about the letters she had received from Cecily. She told him about arriving in November of 1815, the state of the house, the lying in, the February morning. She told him about the conversations with the solicitor and precisely what she had and had not told that man. She told him about Mr. Crane and about Cecily's departure, and about the 14 months since. She told him about the household accounts, about the tenants she had dealt with, about the drainage problem in the South Field that she had resolved in his absence, by means of a conversation with 3 men who had all initially declined to take instruction from a woman and then had, once the matter was presented to them in terms of what would happen to their quarterly rents if the South Field flooded again, found that they could. She did not tell him she was tired. That was not his concern. He listened to all of it without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "The child does not know." "He knows his father was at war." Margaret said, "He knows his father is a great man. He knows his father has come home. Beyond that we have not gone. And Cecily, she wrote once," Margaret said, 6 months after she left. "She said she was well. She said she hoped James was well." "No." His voice was very even. "I would not expect she does." He left the kitchen then, but he did not call for a carriage. He did not call for a solicitor. He walked out to the stables in the rain, and he was gone for 2 hours, and when he came back he reviewed the household accounts with the thoroughness of a man who had managed logistics for a cavalry regiment, and found them, Margaret gathered from his expression. That evening he said, "You will stay, for now until I determine what is to be done." Margaret said, "Yes, Your Grace." She unpacked the trunks. She did not address the letter to Edinburgh. What followed was not easy. But it was, Margaret found, less difficult than she had anticipated. He was a man who had learned somewhere in the schoolroom or the regiment, she couldn't be certain, that silence was not absence. He was present in the house in a way that Cecily had never been, and that Margaret herself had nearly forgotten was possible. He came down to breakfast. He went out to the estate. He sat with James in the evenings and let the child read to him haltingly from a picture book, and did not correct his mistakes. He asked Margaret once a week to go through the accounts with him and listened without interrupting while she explained. He did not explain himself. He did not offer the history of his wound, or his marriage, or the years at war that had carved the lines in his face and settled the particular quality of stillness about him that was not peace, but was something adjacent to it. He gave nothing freely, but he listened to what was given to him, and he remembered it, and he acted on it. She noticed in the 3rd week that he had spoken to the village physician about a matter she had mentioned in passing, a winter ailment in one of the tenant families, and had arranged for medicine. She noticed in the 4th week that a structural repair to the stable roof she had flagged in a household note 3 months before his return had been commissioned. She noticed that he knew James's name for his wooden horse and used it correctly. She noticed these things in the way she noticed everything, quietly, without remark. In December, a letter arrived from Cecily. It was addressed to the Duke. He read it in the study, and then he came and handed it to Margaret without a word, and she read it standing in the corridor with the winter light coming through the window at the end and her hands quite still on the paper. Cecily wrote that she had heard her husband was returned. She wrote that she supposed he was very angry, and she supposed she deserved it. She wrote, in a paragraph of unusual clarity, that she had not been suited to the life she had been given, that she had done a great wrong, and that she did not ask forgiveness, only to be left as she was. She wrote in the final paragraph that Margaret would manage Greymore better than she ever had, and that she had always known this and had found it, in younger years, insupportable to be outdone so thoroughly by a sister who was plain. Margaret stood in the corridor for rather a long time. She was not entirely sure what she was feeling. Something moved in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, and was perhaps simply the long-deferred recognition that she had been wronged, named plainly by the person who had wronged her, and that the naming was in its way a form of being seen. She heard a step in the corridor, and the Duke said without approaching, "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes." And then, because it was true, "It is strange. To be told you have been overlooked, and to have it confirmed, and to find that being confirmed is strange." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been overlooked also in different ways." She looked at him then properly, with the letter still in her hands. He was leaning against the wall of the corridor at a careful distance, and he was watching her with the particular attentiveness he brought to the accounts, or to James's haltingly read sentences, the look of a man who was not expecting to be moved, but who was being moved nonetheless. She said, "By the war." He said, "Before the war, mostly." She understood then what was not said, a father with no warmth to give, or a title that had come too soon and too heavy, or some particular season in which he had learned that the world saw the rank and not the man. She did not ask him to specify. She folded the letter. She said, "I will put this in the accounts file, where the solicitor can find it if he needs to." He said, "Yes, that is sensible." But he did not move, and neither did she, for a moment longer than was required, and the winter light lay between them on the flagstones like something that had been set down carefully and not yet retrieved. It would be many weeks before she understood what that moment was the beginning of. James was ill in January, a chest ailment that kept them both at the child's bedside in turns, through 3 nights of high fever and half-coherent waking, and in the exhaustion and the vigil something altered. The Duke sat on one side of the small bed and Margaret on the other, and they passed between them a lamp and a cloth and a bottle of the physician's preparation. And when James reached out in the 3rd night and put his hand in Margaret's, the Duke looked at that joined grip for a long moment and said, very quietly, "He would have had none of this without you," Margaret said. "He has you now." He looked at her then, and she looked back at him. And the fever broke that morning, James's small body loosening into ordinary sleep, and they both stayed until they were certain. And then Margaret excused herself to take an hour of rest, and she went to the schoolroom and sat in the chair by the window and felt for the first time in 3 years the particular quality of not being alone that she had almost forgotten existed, and also, somewhat alarmingly, the particular quality of something else, something warmer. Something she had not permitted herself before, and did not know quite what to do with now. She was not a woman who allowed herself things she could not afford. She was not a woman who built expectations from materials that would not support them. She knew her position with a precision that verged on the mathematical. She was the sister of his runaway wife, the guardian of his son, the manager of his estate, and she was plain, and she was 26, and she had no fortune and no prospects and nothing to recommend her but the fact that she knew how to keep a household and a child and a set of accounts, functioning in the absence of anyone better. But he had said he would have had none of this without you, and something in the way he had said it, not as a compliment, not as a performance, but as a simple recognizing truth, had moved in her, like a fault line, quiet and deep. She put it away. She was very good at putting things away. She put it away for 6 weeks. She managed the household, James and the accounts and the late winter repairs, and a dispute between 2 tenant families that required careful navigation, and she was very nearly successful. She was nearly successful until a Tuesday morning in late February, the first warm morning of the year, when she was in the south garden cutting dead stems from the rose beds with her coat pushed back and her hair coming loose, and the Duke came around the garden wall and stopped. He said, "There you are," she said without turning. "Here I am." He came and stood beside her. After a moment he said, "James told me this morning that you have been teaching him to read in French. He will need it eventually." Margaret said, "Better to begin young. He told me also that you are teaching him to count. He can count to 30 already. We are working on 31. She cut another dead stem with perhaps more precision than the task strictly required. He said, "What will you do when this is resolved? When the legal matter of the marriage is settled, the child is secured, and the estate is properly in hand, what will you do?" She was still for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "I haven't decided. There is a situation in Edinburgh," she said, and hated immediately that she had said it, because it sounded like a prepared exit, and it was, and he would know it. He said, "You have been preparing to leave." "I have been preparing," she said, "to be sent away. Those are different." A silence followed. She cut another stem. The morning was cold and clear, and smelled of turned earth and wet stone and the faint green beginning of something under the dead garden. He said, "I am not going to send you away." She turned to look at him then, because she could not help it. He was looking at the rose beds, not at her, and there was something in his profile, the jaw, the saber cut, visible below his left cuff, that was not cold, precisely, but was very controlled. It was the face of a man who was saying something true that he had not said before and was proceeding with careful deliberateness. He said, "I am aware that what I am about to say is not uncomplicated, given the circumstances, and I would not press you for an answer. Now." She waited. He said, "But I am asking you to consider, not as a household arrangement, not as a guardian of James, but as a thing that might be wanted by both parties." The spring garden was very quiet. She said slowly, "You are asking me to consider." "Yes." "While the marriage is still legally in place. The solicitor assures me it will not be so for long. Cecily has written to him also. The grounds are clear. And you are asking me, while it is not resolved, to consider." "I am asking you," he said, and now he did look at her, with the grey eyes that James had inherited and that she had been looking at for 3 years. "Whether you would be willing to be considered, that is not the same as being asked." Margaret Ashcroft, who was plain and 26, and who had spent 3 years holding a household together with no assistance and no acknowledgement, and no prospect of any future that was not the Edinburgh situation or some other version of the same useful invisibility. Not collapse, release. The particular sensation of a weight that has been carried so long it has become load-bearing, and then is carefully, deliberately set down. She said, "I would be willing to be considered." He nodded, once, precisely. She turned back to the roses. But the season was not yet finished with her. Cecily came in March. She arrived in a hired carriage, without Mr. Crane, in the early afternoon, and she was thinner than Margaret remembered, and her famous golden hair was dressed with less care than it had once been, and she stood in the hall of Graymore Hall and looked at her sister, and said, They went to the sitting room. Cecily sat with her hands folded and said without preamble that Mr. Crane had gone, that the situation in Bath had become untenable, that she had come to see if there was. She paused and chose her words with something like honesty. If there was any help to be had, Margaret looked at her sister. She had at various points over the past 3 years been angry at Cecily. She had been exhausted by Cecily. She had, in dark moments, felt something close to hatred, though she had not permitted herself to examine it too carefully. She had, in lighter moments, felt something close to pity, which she had also put away. She looked at Cecily now, and she felt quite simply sad. Sad for the woman her sister had needed to be, and the woman she had failed to become, and the great bright force of Cecily's beauty and charm that had always been pointed outward and had, in the end, found nothing solid to stick to. She said, "The house is not mine to offer. I will speak to the Duke." Cecily's expression shifted. She said, "You will speak to him as a household manager," Margaret said, "as someone he will listen to." Cecily said slowly, "Margaret, and then, I see." Alastair Vane, informed of the situation that evening, considered it for less than a minute. He arranged for Cecily to be established in the dower house, which was smaller and colder, but habitable, and for a quarterly allowance, and for no contact with James beyond what James himself might wish for when he was old enough to know the whole of it. He did this methodically, and then he went to the study, and he closed the door and was not seen for the rest of the evening. Margaret did not knock on the study door. She sat in the schoolroom, and she let him have the evening that he needed. The next morning he came to breakfast, and she set his plate before him. And he looked at her and said, "That is done with," she said. He said, "Then we may proceed." She said, "To what, Your Grace?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "To what we agreed to consider." A year later, just short of a year, for the legal machinery had moved with reasonable speed, and the spring had been warm and the tenants had had a good harvest, and James had learned to count to 100 and was beginning with some confidence. Quot unsimple sums. Margaret Ashcroft became Margaret Vane in the Greymoor Church on a Tuesday morning in early April, with James as the only witness who truly mattered, and the moors outside the narrow windows green and enormous under a grey sky. There was no announcement in the London papers. Margaret was given to understand, some raised eyebrows in the county, and probably more in the ton. Had anyone at the ton taken sufficient interest in the second sister of the woman who had run off from the Duke of Mereth to trouble themselves to comment? No one who mattered to her raised an eyebrow, and the ones who did, she had never required to be happy. Alastair Vane, standing in the April sun in the Greymoor churchyard, with James on his hip and his new wife beside him, was not a demonstrative man. He had not over the course of the year become one. He had become, instead, precise in his generosity, the look across the kitchen table that was not the look of an employer, the question about Edinburgh that he had not raised again, the moment, on a January morning, when James had been ill and the fever had broken, that he had said what he said. He said, now, standing in the churchyard, "You did not have to stay," Margaret said. "No," he said, "you stayed because of James." In the beginning, she said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. James was pointing at something in the churchyard, a rabbit that had emerged from behind a headstone, and both of them watched it. He said, "And now," she said, "and now I stay because it is my home, and because James is mine. And because you asked me to consider, and I considered, and I found the answer was not ambiguous." He looked at her. Something moved in the grey eyes, which were the eyes she had looked at for 3 years across kitchen tables and account books and a sick child's bedside, and which she knew now, in the way you know a landscape you have lived in until it is less a thing you see than a thing you feel. He said, "No, I found that also." The rabbit crossed the churchyard wall and was gone. They went home. It was recorded many years later in a small memoir of household correspondence preserved by the family, letters between 2 women, a century old when they were finally bound and catalogued, that the Duchess of Meath, née Ashcroft, the elder sister, had managed the estate of Gremore Hall through the Napoleonic years and her husband's long absence, and had done so with a competency that the steward's records bore out in careful detail. The letters mentioned in passing, they mentioned, with more detail than might have been expected, an Edinburgh situation that had never been taken up. They mentioned, in a single sentence, that she had found the answer not ambiguous. The catalogue entry, written by a scholar who had read a great many family papers, noted simply that the letters demonstrated unusual practical intelligence and a marked capacity for endurance. The scholar had missed, as scholars sometimes do, the sentence about Edinburgh, or had not known how much weight to give to the word not. James Vane, who grew up on the Yorkshire moors, with a father who counted things carefully, and a mother who had taught him French, and numbers who knew more of his own history than most thought he did, and had chosen with the particular wisdom of children who have been given good models. To be satisfied with what he had, James Vane married well and managed his estate well, and was known in the county as a man of uncommon steadiness. His own daughter, riding out to the moors in the early years of a new century, found in the schoolroom at Gremore Hall a writing table with a single drawer, and in the drawer a letter addressed to an Edinburgh governess, unsealed, never sent. She kept it. She did not entirely understand it, but she kept it because it felt like something that had mattered once. A road not taken, a door that had stood open and then had not been walked through, and that it should be possible, if you held the letter and stood in the schoolroom in the winter light, to understand at least a little the particular quality of the woman who had sat here, and had decided